Here.
Okay. Paula,
Someone still has the main call open, I think.
your screen.
Okay.
Do you see a little box that has something that looks like little?
Hello. Chris, do you know if everyone's here?
I will take a look back. Sorry. We're looking for Trent Gordon, and that was it.
Oh, here's Trent Gordon. Here we go.
And then we're all here.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Mary.
Thank you for being interested in school finance. I will share my screen of the SWOT analysis, and we can have a discussion about the strengths, threats, opportunities, and weaknesses. I can be the scribe also and record our key ideas. I would like to ask for a volunteer from the group to be our spokesperson. So it seems that it would be at our next meeting potentially when one of us will share in the whole group session what some of our notes are on this SWOT analysis. So are one of you willing to volunteer to be the spokesperson when we come together at the next meeting?
I can do it.
Thank you, Courtney. Much
Yep.
appreciated.
I don't know if that'll make sense, but I'll do it.
Well, you'll have the document to rely on. So.
Okay.
All right, let me share my screen. Hang on. Can you see it now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So before we dive into our conversation regarding strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, are there any particular questions or reflections about the finance presentation to get the conversation started?
I had a question about the OEPP measure that you presented. I was under the impression that our expenditures per pupil were generally less than a peer group and less than state average. So I'm wondering what that measure included. I'm not sure if it was in the slide that you presented. If it was, I kind of missed it. But does it include all sorts of expenditures, or including debt service, for instance?
It follows the state formula for the operating expense per pupil. So no, it would not include debt expenses. It's strictly operating expenses, in a general term. I'm sure the state operating expense per pupil is less than 14,000. And do you have a reflection as to where you've seen that information, as to, where did you come away with that conclusion that we were lower than our peers or lower than the state?
I don't recall.
Okay.
Maybe we can take this offline. I'm just curious about that because it's different than a fundamental belief I've had about that level of expenditure per pupil. So I'd be interested in digging into it more, and maybe I'll go back and look at what I was referring to or what I was recollecting on that measure.
Okay, we can certainly talk offline. Sure.
Could it be you're thinking of the state aid per pupil?
No.
Okay.
That's not it.
Okay.
Mary, does that figure that you quoted include like transportation costs? Not just like supplies and meals?
Yes. So I don't really think it's helpful to spend a whole lot of time on the operating expense per pupil. I think that in many cases it can be misleading when we compare to other school districts because, for example, they may have their own staff for transportation. They don't contract out. So it can be situations where you're not really comparing apples to apples. However, it is a metric that there is often interest in, and so that's why I included it in the presentation. But I don't think that it gives, I don't think it's very telling. It's not super telling about the district's current financial position or our priority for expenditures and our primary sources of revenue. So it is a metric, but not necessarily one that's super telling.
As your comment about apples to apples kind of thing. I mean, districts that have, center schools might be able to more easily adjust their class sizes, where we have the neighborhood elementaries, right, where things like that could cause discrepancies district to district, among other things, right?
Right.
So, and if I can share like my understanding of OEPP, it's a state attempt to compare district apples to apples. And what you have to know is it's just a tool to get to a number and then understand who your benchmarks are. Like, do they outsource transportation or do they have it in-house? Do they run various programs within custodial maintenance? Is that in-house, outsourced? Understanding what's happening in the district and your benchmarks is important to tell your story. And it does fluctuate over time. It's just one metric, in my opinion, the state puts out to help tell a story because everyone does things different.
Yeah, thank you, Brittany. Okay. Any other reflections?
I was wondering about the school's bond rating. I apologize if you mentioned that, but just curious where that stands. And is that how you, being unfamiliar with school financials, is that how is that how your debt gets graded, or is there another way that happens?
I did not mention the district's bond rating, and yes, every time a school district issues new debt, the district is re-rated, and depending on circumstances, during annual review or monitoring, you may have a second visit by Moody's. You may have a visit from Moody's every year to reevaluate your rating. It depends what kind of financial circumstances have occurred, whether you're going to trigger that ongoing monitoring. But at a minimum, every new bond issue is re-rated for the school district. We did just recently refinance the debt certificates that were issued in August of 2018 for the solar project. And we paid off those debt certificate and issued bonds. And we saved $250,000 for the district by that refinancing. So the debt certificates were issued by a local bank, and they were issued at a rate of 3.5%. And of course, given the state of the economy and realizing what rates dropped to in July when I started, we quickly began to have conversations about making a change and brought the idea to the Board of Education, and we moved forward with that refinancing.
So sorry, what is the school's current bond rating?
I believe it's AA2.
Okay, so it's very strong then. Okay.
It's very strong. Yep.
All right. Thank you.
While we're talking about long-term debt, though, I did comment that in the financial profile score, that the category where we received the lowest point, which was one of 4, was in the long-term debt remaining. And we have outstanding debt, which is equal to roughly 85% of the allowable. So we almost maxed out what we can issue in the form of long-term debt. So I think that's something to consider, and might very well be something we would consider to be a weakness. So should there be a facility need of some sort, we would be in a challenging place to consider how we could finance that facility project given the current outstanding debt.
When does that roll off?
The levy year 2023.
Okay, so it could be an opportunity too, right? Like
If we're able to plan for levy year 2024, if we have that foresight to anticipate, yes, exactly. And just to explain, the limitation is specified in state statute. It's 6.9% for an elementary district, 6.9% of EAV. So, if we were to have an increase in EAV, obviously that threshold for debt would improve. If we have a decrease in EAV, that threshold for debt would get smaller. So that's an interesting connection to the property values that exist within the taxing jurisdiction of the school district, that it's directly connected to our ability to issue debt. So something else to think about.
Its categorization as long-term debt, that must not refer to the amount of the remaining term, but the overall term, is that right?
All long-term debt outstanding.
So long-term meaning as seen through the lens of the overall initial term, not because we'd only have, 4 years remaining, and 5 years, it typically is long-term in finance speak, right?
Right. So if you think of a capital lease, that would be deemed as short-term, and a bond issue is long-term, just simply.
so typically under a year with those short term when you talk schools.
Okay. Good to know. That's funny, Brittany, when she first mentioned the idea of long-term, I put it in opportunities, the upcoming retirement of the long-term debt. And then Mary said, it could be considered a weakness. And I hadn't thought of that part of it.
Well, okay, it can be both, right?
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think couple that, right? Like maybe it's a weakness if we knew enrollment was going to boom, but we've seen declining enrollment, right? So like, how do you balance that building needs per se? Because usually that's why you do long-term debt, right? So I think it lives in both. And I do think an opportunity could be declining enrollment. I mean, if you're just looking financial lens, like not anything else, declining enrollment does help with you financially if you're in the business of people.
That's another interesting topic, because if you think of an enrollment declining by 400 students over the last 5 years, and the way it could be spread out among our schools and among the sections within the schools, that could be, a two student decline, depending on where the decreases are happening. It might not really translate into needing fewer teachers necessarily, but it all depends on where the reductions are happening.
You brought up
Right, and
earlier
so-
about the grade level centers versus the neighborhood schools. And that is very similar to what this might be, is that you might lose a couple kids here and there, but it may not make a difference in staffing. For a
Totally
particular-
not to digress, but do they travel a lot between buildings or no? Like specials? Okay, thanks.
Yeah,
The specials
besides
teachers, some
elementary
special.
specials teachers.
Okay.
Also, the declining enrollment, though, in some areas, enrollment, at least where I'm at, our enrollment for special ed preschool is actually increasing.
So those subgroups that are increasing.
Yeah.
ELL,
Like
special ed.
Right, like at the Early Childhood Center, we have our Preschool for All program, which is for at-risk, and we're allotted 60 spots by the state grant. But I am full at 60, and I have a wait list of 33, and I have 20 preschool screening requests pending. So there are kids coming if they stay in our district. So I don't know if that's something to measure future enrollment by or not.
When we look at the SWOT, I guess my question is subgroup increasing, like again, total financial lens? Like to me, I'm a numbers person. That's dollars, right? I see EL, I see low income, that's money. I guess there is funding opportunities that come available because of that, or is that a threat, like to other things, like because those require more money? Like again, just financial ones, like not
Right.
that it's bad to have them.
Because it can be a trade-off. And so while you have subgroups increasing and these subgroups potentially have greater needs or more expensive needs, so to speak, then that means you, with limited resources, you may have to do away with something else, or you may have to reduce something else in order to meet these groups.
So, but from a state funding formula, is a student, or do they account for additional funding based on subgroups?
Yes and yes.
Yes and yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there are
So-
grants available, like the Preschool for All grant is a funded program. And that
And then-
funds 60 of our students.
Right. And,
Right,
and,
a
and
student
so,
used to be a student under general state aid. EBF changed that and said we recognize not every 3,800 pupil district is the same. They have different students with different needs, and that's what EBF attempted to address. But we're already in the lowest tier. I mean, what it does is it affects your tier rating, your percent away from adequacy. Because a student with special needs, they recognize it takes more resources to properly educate that student.
that's right. So in the EBF formula, there are roughly 30 metrics that are used to build the cost of adequacy, the adequacy target. And so the formula looks at certain class sizes by grade level, looks at the student population, low income, second language, pre-kindergarten. It's a very complex structure to calculate the adequacy target. And to Jason's point, that when the subgroups increase, that your adequacy target is going to get bigger, larger. It's a more expensive number. But if your resources are flat, then your percentage to adequacy is going to go down. It's going to drop. So I do want to highlight that, you know, the overall decline in enrollment, if you think about it, 10 percentage points over a 10-year time period is really relatively small. It's 400 students over 10 years, so it's 40 kiddos across 7 buildings. So it gets minimized when you divide it by building by grade level and so on. The subgroups are increasing, but also at a slow rate. So I don't see this as a threat per se, because they're both changing at a gradual pace, such that we can anticipate and be planful in the appropriate manner for these adjustments.
Can I ask what might be a silly question?
Sure.
So declining in enrollment overall is an opportunity. Are you saying that declining in enrollment could in a way improve our financial standing? Or is it just help us balance the budget more?
Well, I think it depends where the declines occur. You know, so we are talking about the subgroups that increase. When enrollment decreases, as Chris commented, that when we look at those declines across 7 buildings and all of the grade levels and then each classroom, that it may not be significant enough that triggers a reduction in the number of teachers. And so, you know, when you have an enrollment decline to that extent that we realize, oh, we'll need fewer teachers next year, that's when we would see our salaries and benefits decline, when we need to make those kinds of adjustments. I think from a school district perspective, that most often where we see the most significant changes in FTEs are programmatic. So when a program is eliminated, or when a program is added, that's when we see the most significant year-to-year changes in staffing. It's triggered by programmatic changes, programmatic needs, change in needs.
And kind of
To add to that,
What's that?
do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, and I was just gonna chime in that, you talked about programmatic changes. Just this year, we've been informed by the state that, we'll need to, start the one-way immersion classes at every building because of our numbers, our students who speak Spanish, within each building. So now we're looking at, I think it's 5 additional staff members across the district to make that happen. So there's your programmatic change, and it's when you're talking finances, we're adding 5 positions, we're not cutting, so that is not, that's a threat.
But categorically for us, unfunded mandates are a constant threat. And that's an example of one right there.
Mhm.
And then you're talking about EBF before, and EBF is a threat too, because yes, they passed the law, but the funding for it is unstable. And this year they were supposed to, or last year, whenever it was, they were supposed to increase that bucket and the state chose not to.
So I think the threat overall is Springfield. Every district, Springfield is the threat.
Oh,
we don't know
it's
right? It encompasses all of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, programmatic.
I put property tax freeze as another threat.
Yeah, that's craziness.
Pension cost shift, that's on the table.
It's a great one.
Those, the tax freeze, the cost shift, and the EBF funding are probably the 3 biggest ones.
Mhm.
I think its strengths you should put fund balance. I mean, you're holding above, and you're holding above the policy. So I mean, that's you're saving for a rainy day as you outlined you wanted to.
Is that ISB recommendation? I mean, look, our peer group is way, way, way beyond where we are. And that ISB recommendation, is that grounded in any data? I mean, has that been proven to be a fund balance that's guarantees solvency for X number of years or something like that?
Right. Well, so the concept, 25% obviously is 3 months of expenses, right? And so, there is a significant disparity between school districts across the state of Illinois as to their resources. So when you think about school districts in the rural areas versus school districts in affluent suburbs, those resources vary tremendously. So, you'll see school districts where the property tax revenue makes up 95% of the revenue. They're tier 4 districts. Their adequacy, the percent of adequacy is, over 100%. They're at 110%, 115%. And so there's tremendous variety of situations, district by district, across the state of Illinois. I do like the EBF funding formula for that reason, because it does connect specifically to that district's unique demographics and that district's unique local funding possibilities. And it's hands down more fair in my mind than the general state aid formula was.
The whole harmless was really necessary politically to get that through, even though that might have been even made it more fair if there was some other mechanism. I mean, nobody wants to get less state aid than they got the year before. I get it.
Right.
But some didn't need, some they were getting.
Right. I do wonder, there's also, we said Springfield. I do wonder who's in the governor's seat. And, come re-election time, every governor has a different approach. And I think that also the turnover in elected official positions can also have an impact. So when we say Springfield, I don't know if we mean specifically legislative changes or as well as turnover in elected officials.
I think Springfield says it all.
Okay. Any other strengths?
I put discipline around avoiding deficits, balanced budget, but that's kind of part and parcel of the first two. But
Controlled and conscious spending.
Yeah, historical surpluses.
interesting note about those surpluses that were upwards of $1 million in 2019 and 2020. Those were some monies that we got, incremental EBF monies that we hadn't had plans for how to spend them to address the inadequacies. So those surpluses look like big numbers on paper, but the very next year we figured out how to address some of the distance to adequacy that the reason we were given that money was to do something with it, right? Mm-hmm. Hire instructional coaches, for instance, or something like that.
Mm-hmm. So I think that goes back to Mary's analogy of like when you get your paycheck, right? So fund balance at June 30th, and Mary, I'm assuming you're not backing out early taxes. Like that's a trend in some Lake County districts.
Right.
Okay. So you're essentially getting your paycheck in May to operate school next year, right? Your first big, so like your big chunk. So you're saying those surpluses, you got the money before June 30th for something that you were going to do till next year. So again, like what's the story of why the surplus was there? And unfortunately, it's just the timing of when they release those funds.
Mm-hmm. Right. And you know, I spent the bulk of my career in Cook County, and Cook County's on an entirely different cycle. And so if we were to compare ourselves, you know, when I chose the peer groups, I chose only Lake County districts for that very reason. You wouldn't want to compare to a Cook County school district because they're on a completely different cycle. So what's in fund balance as of June 30th in one county can be entirely different than what's on the books in another county. So that's, you know, I think that's a nuance to the whole structure, you know.
And a nuance in Lake County, the difference. Wealthier districts in Lake County report fund balance different for early taxes. So Lake Forest School District 67, when I worked there, we always backed out of early taxes. So if Mary pulled up that graph, you would see that how is Lake Forest not having any money? They got to be broke. No, we weren't broke. We were just saying that that's not money for this year. So we back it out and we do it on an accrual. The state formula doesn't allow for that balance. They just say 25%.
Right.
So you just got to know what your benchmarks are doing.
Right. And so those years, the last 2 years where we had the surpluses of roughly $1 million, you know, we're still ending with a fund balance of about 40%, which, you know, as members of the community and members of the board, I would be quite pleased with that. If board policy says we're striving for 25 to 30 and we're slightly above that, I think that's the perfect place to be because you're well poised to respond to a change. I think it's important for school districts you need to be somewhat nimble in some situations when it comes to decision making. And when you have that appropriate safety margin in your reserves, you can be more nimble in your decision making, and you can be responsive. So, you know, so I think that I would be very, you know, I think board members and community should be pleased that fund balance is at about 40%.
What about weaknesses? Yeah. What needs improvement?
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes left. We talked a little bit about long-term debt as being a weakness and an opportunity for the reasons we already discussed. What other weaknesses are on the minds of the group tonight?
Well, I guess I'm just wondering, like, is there a 5-year capital plan? And, you know, we talked about current facilities, but is there a concern about like age of plant that is going to need to be addressed in the next, you know, 5 to 10 years? Is that strength, weakness? I'm just curious about that. Right.
And so, yes, there is a facility plan, and the district allots a certain portion of the operation and maintenance fund monies to capital projects every year. So it's an interfund transfer from O&M to capital projects to address facility needs per this planning schedule. And so of course there can be facility needs, a boiler can blow or a roof can go and outside of the planned schedule. But I do think it's important, and I believe it's been some time since the district has reviewed the facility plan, at least at the board level, to take another look at where are we now, what do we need to plan for, and what do we need to queue up in order to meet that schedule of facility needs.
Yeah, so I think there's a high level expectation that we know things come up, and that there's, certain things that are known, like we knew that the roof was going to need to be done at, right.
View, yeah.
But I think a facility plan refresh is probably a weakness. We need a facility plan refresh and update for sure.
Is that one only being done internally right now, or is that with an architect?
With an architect, yeah.
I had another weakness as, and it's unique. I think it's somewhat unique to the nature of our property tax base being largely residential. I think that it's kind of a half a political weakness and half, it's true. Our property, the homeowner in our district suffers quite a bit because of our lack of diversified tax base.
Mm-hmm.
And Jason, I was going to say that as well. It's not a topic that we touched upon, but the lack of commercial properties that we can pull revenue from, or planning for the future of Grayslake. We're kind of locked in as this is what we have.
Yeah, so much of our property tax base has, student, or not to be crass, but a cost associated with it. Whereas, other districts, just look to our east, right? Woodland has, Gurney Mills and Great America, and we don't. But it also a larger discussion about what kind of community do we want to live in? Do we want Gurney Mills in our backyard? I don't know the answer to that. I have my own feelings on it, but.
Right.
I can tell you, I'm a Woodland resident, and our taxes are ridiculous. I don't know where those, to have so many industries, you would think that our taxes were lower, but they're like, people are leaving because our taxes have gotten, I think they give a lot of tax breaks to draw the businesses in.
So I think your comment though is a great example, and kind of leading off of like, does the taxpayer in Grayslake know that it's largely residential? So maybe like the education around it, right? You're not a typical like, you're not sure why Woodland is. You just said that, like, I don't know why it is. It just is, right? To understand why it is what it is.
Yeah, the bedroom communities like Grayslake have really high taxes.
Well, I think too, like, people throw around like, well, Abbott's building that new center off of Allegheny. Well, that's Fremont. Like, they get that. Like, that's not 46. It might be a Grayslake address. So the education of what actually is 46 versus 127.
I think that brings up another weakness too, is that we don't have a way to monitor the assumptions that we make financial decisions on. So to your point, Jana, we've operated under a narrative, and many communities do, that if we build and diversify the tax base, that then we will see a reduction and the tax burden on residents will be decreased. But it would be good to have some way to monitor to see if that actually happens. There's quite a bit that says it doesn't. And I think there's some gray areas. So I think there are times when it does, but there are many more times when it doesn't. So it'd be good to know, how do we monitor that to make good decisions?
So Christy, you're suggesting monitor development and impact on taxes? Is that what I'm understanding?
I think it has more to do with develop a system to challenge our assumptions and make sure that we have a way to monitor whether our assumptions are correct or not. And more importantly, when they're correct and when their time has passed.
Would that be accomplished, like partnering with the village when they bring in new businesses?
Yeah, and that might be an opportunity too, that we can partner with other taxing bodies and get really clear on what our priorities are for as a community, an entire community. I just read an article that said that because remote learning or remote working has become more common now, that bedroom communities are seeing an increase in interest. People no longer have to live close to where they work, so they want to live in places that have green spaces and natural spaces where they can raise their kids or their kids can run around like ours do. So,
I heard
what's that?
I think I either heard or read that same thing.
Yeah. I think another opportunity is, and it's a little, digresses a little bit, but we have, I think, a pretty compelling invitation to develop a robust sustainability plan so that we can look at local resources and use them intentionally. It kind of piggybacks off of developing partnerships with other taxing bodies.
Okay, so we're right at 9 o'clock. I want to respect everyone's time. I know we've put in a good solid 3 hours here. In conclusion, I'd like to ask the group about a strength that that's been on my mind, and it's about ROI, return on investment. So when we think about ROI, how are we spending money? How are we being fiscally responsible with the taxpayers' money? And tonight, when Paul Lewis presented the his presentation tonight and commented about 2 schools that are exemplary, and the balance of schools are commendable. In my mind, that speaks highly to ROI, and I see that as a strength. So I put that out there to the group in conclusion for your consideration.
I like it.
Gary?
That's a good point.
Okay.
I wanted to add legislative advocacy as an opportunity, even though I don't feel it's as big an opportunity as the threats that exist in Springfield, but
Are you thinking more locally or?
local, county, state,
Oh.
legislative advocacy is what I said. It's late.
Yeah.
And Jason, you mean for like EBF and that too, right? Is that what?
I mean, like, you know, I know Christy's done a lot of good work around EdRed and talking about things like that. EdRed, you know, could we have mustered and marshaled a better advocacy effort around the fair tax, things like that?
And
Just
to make
making sure, like, Gray's like 46 voices heard in what's happening in Springfield.
And making sure credit goes where it's due. It's not me, it's Christy Braden.
Christy D. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for participating. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness and the conversation we've had tonight in this small group.
Thank you.
Mary.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Good night.
Bye.